Scientists are stunned. What they find beneath the shimmering surface of the tropical Atlantic, far from the gaze of satellites or passing ships, is something massive. It's not a mountain or a current. It's not even visible to the eyes. Yet, it spans from the shores of Brazil to the coast of West Africa, stretching thousands of kilometers across the equator. A silent giant, resting in the dark ocean depths. Scientists call it the Atlantic Equatorial Water, a vast, hidden blob of water with its unique fingerprint. For years, it was overlooked or mistaken for something else. But now, thanks to advanced technology and decades of data, this enormous water mass has finally emerged from obscurity. And what it reveals is shocking. This is Atlantic Equatorial Water, a vast, thermocline-bound reservoir that was always there, but no one noticed. The missing puzzle piece. The ocean is a world of hidden patterns. Oceanographers devote their lives to tracing layers of water based on traits like temperature, salinity, and density. These characteristics define unique water masses stacked one above the other like invisible layers in a giant underwater layer cake, from the surface down to the ocean's darkest depths. For decades, researchers had identified special equatorial water masses in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, unique mid-depth waters formed by the blending of northern and southern currents. But when they looked to the Atlantic, that expected equatorial layer seemed to be missing. This was a mystery. After all, equatorial ocean dynamics are quite similar across the globe: water masses and the thermocline. Before diving into the Atlantic Equatorial Water, let's pause to understand what a water mass is. In oceanography, a water mass isn't simply a section of seawater. It's a precisely defined body that originates from a specific region and carries a stable set of characteristics, especially in terms of temperature and salinity. These traits act like a fingerprint, allowing scientists to track and distinguish one water mass from another across vast distances. Now, in the vertical structure of the ocean, water masses typically settle into layers. The surface layer is warm and turbulent. The bottom layer is cold and dense. Between them lies the thermocline, a boundary zone where temperature rapidly changes with depth. This middle layer, the thermocline, is crucial. It acts like a buffer, separating warm surface waters from cold depths, and it's exactly where equatorial water masses tend to form. In the Pacific and Indian Oceans, this is where equatorial waters were found as early as the 1940s. These waters are formed when central waters from both hemispheres meet and mix near the equator, creating a hybrid mass with distinct thermal and saline characteristics. Until recently, oceanographers thought the Atlantic missed out on this phenomenon. How scientists map invisible waters? The answer: you can measure the ocean. That's where the Argo program comes in, a worldwide system of more than 3,000 autonomous floats scattered across the oceans. These robotic instruments move vertically through the water, collecting detailed measurements of temperature and salinity down to depths of 2,000 meters. After each dive, they rise to the surface and send their data back via satellite, providing scientists with an unprecedented view of the ocean's interior. Since its launch in 1998, the Argo program has quietly transformed how we study the inner workings of the ocean. These self-operating floats now deliver over 100,000 temperature and salinity profiles annually. And when it comes to the Atlantic, that data has been a game-changer. When scientists began reanalyzing Argo's massive data archive, they noticed something strange: an unexpected temperature-salinity curve hiding between the known curves of the North and South Atlantic central waters. It was subtle, easy to miss, and long mistaken for part of the southern mass. But under scrutiny, it stood out. It had its shape, its range, and its behavior. It was the Atlantic Equatorial Water, the gigantic blob itself. Geographically, AEW spans from about 10 degrees south to 10 degrees north, forming a band along the Atlantic equator. It stretches laterally from the coast of Brazil across to the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa. Think of it as a vast underwater equatorial belt, invisible to the eye but massive in scale. Vertically, AEW sits in the ocean's permanent thermocline, between 200 and 800 meters deep, safely tucked below the mixed surface layer and above the abyssal deep. What makes it unique is its origin. AEW forms through isopycnal mixing, the blending of waters along surfaces where density remains constant. It emerges from the interaction between two adjacent water masses, the warm, salty South Atlantic Central Water, SACW, and the cooler, fresher North Atlantic Central Water, NACW. According to the study published in Geophysical Research Letters, the mix is roughly 3.5 parts SACW to 1 part NACW. This ratio creates a hybrid water mass with a unique thermal and saline signature that's just different enough from its parents to stand out, once you look closely enough. Why it was hidden? Given its massive size, spanning thousands of kilometers across the equatorial Atlantic, how did Atlantic Equatorial Water, AEW, remain undetected for so long? The answer comes down to data resolution. For most of the 20th century, oceanographic data relied heavily on sparse, ship-based measurements. These offered only intermittent snapshots of the water column, often hundreds of kilometers apart, with limited depth resolution. It wasn't until the early 2000s, with the global deployment of Argo floats, that the game changed. Argo provided continuous high-resolution, vertical profiles of temperature and salinity across the world's oceans, including the undersampled equatorial Atlantic. With this dense data network, researchers were finally able to detect a consistent intermediate layer, warmer and saltier than SACW, extending across the basin. As lead scientist Victor Jurbas explained, it was easy to confuse the Atlantic Equatorial Water with the South Atlantic Central Water. It was necessary to have a fairly dense network of vertical temperature and salinity profiles. A reservoir of climate clues. Now that AEW is identified, the scientific implications are big. Water masses in the thermocline aren't static. They store heat, salt, oxygen, and even dissolved carbon, and they transport these quantities across ocean basins over years or decades. That makes them critical players in climate and circulation models. By understanding AEW, researchers can better model equatorial mixing in the Atlantic, track heat transport patterns, and predict how the region responds to climate shifts like El Niño Southern Oscillation or the Atlantic Niño. Thermocline waters like AEW are sensitive indicators of broader climate variability. Shifts in their properties, such as warming or freshening, could be early signs of larger ocean atmosphere changes. In other words, AEW may act as a climate memory, holding on to heat and salinity changes long after surface conditions have changed. Completing the global pattern. The discovery of Atlantic Equatorial Water, AEW, resolves a long-standing asymmetry in global oceanography, a puzzle that had persisted for decades. For decades, scientists studying the oceans had identified unique equatorial water layers in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Now, with AEW identified, that gap has been closed. The Atlantic wasn't truly different, we simply hadn't examined it with enough detail. Now that it's been identified, scientists can incorporate the Atlantic into a global framework for equatorial thermocline structures. This unified approach holds significant value. It helps fine-tune climate models, deepens our insight into how heat and salinity move through the ocean, and improves the accuracy of global ocean maps. It also opens the door for more meaningful comparisons between the world's major ocean basins. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even in our data-saturated world, some of the planet's most significant features can remain hidden until science finds the right lens to see them. What's next for AEW research? Identifying AEW is just the beginning. Now researchers want to understand how it changes over time. Is AEW getting warmer or saltier? Is its extent expanding or contracting with climate change? How does it interact with seasonal currents like the equatorial undercurrent or longer-term shifts in Atlantic heat content? There's also interest in how AEW affects marine ecosystems. Because it lies in the thermocline, AEW could influence nutrient supply to the surface and oxygen distribution at depth, both key factors in biological productivity and ocean health. Moreover, the methods used to identify AEW, detailed volumetric temperature salinity analysis, may uncover other hidden water masses elsewhere in the world's oceans. The story of AEW may be just one chapter in a much larger book still being written by autonomous floats and deep-sea sensors. So the next time you gaze out at the Atlantic, remember, beneath the waves, beneath the currents, beneath even the reach of sunlight, lies a silent, sprawling presence, a massive, blended water mass, flowing from Brazil to Africa. It doesn't churn, it doesn't rise, it doesn't roar, but it's there, carrying the memory of climate, the fingerprint of mixing, and the signature of discovery.